My husband drank too much during social events and suffered an acute myocardial infarction. He died after being sent to the hospital. After his death, more than a dozen banks and loan sharks came to me to repay their debts. I then realized that he was in debt. I sold everything I could, but the money was just a drop in the bucket. The loan sharks even forced me to work in a club. For 10 years, I was humiliated and contracted a lot of diseases. The doctor said I could live for at most 1 month. I was walking on a remote road in a daze, when a luxury car suddenly rushed out and hit me. The people who got out of the car were my husband, who was supposed to have been dead for 10 years, and his first love. Why did you pretend to be dead? I asked angrily. Because I won $200 million in the lottery, and I don't want to share it with you. This vicious man, in order to enjoy the lottery alone, lived a carefree life with his first love, but left me with a huge debt. He reversed the car and cruelly ran over me. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to the day when he faked his death. Sister-in-law, the dead cannot be resurrected, please accept my condolences. David, the attending doctor, who is also a good friend of my husband, comforted me. I touched my face, which was smooth and delicate. In my previous life, I had a heart disease and my face was covered with dense pustules. I confirmed that I was reborn. My husband James' body was lying quietly on the bed, with a white sheet covering his head from feet. I burst into tears and rushed over to tear off the white sheet. You bastard, I told you so many times not to drink, but you just wouldn't listen. You just closed your eyes and left, leaving me alone in this world. How am I going to live in the future? I cried heartbreakingly and slapped his face hard. James' face was red from my slap, but his body didn't move at all. It seemed that he had been given a sedative or something like that. His body couldn't move, but he was still conscious. Seeing James's face turn red, David was so scared that he hurried over to stop me. After all, dead people don't blush. Sister-in-law, calm down. I know you are very sad, but it won't help to vent your anger on James's body. David said in front of the body. I knew in my heart that David and James were in cahoots. David was the key to the whole fake death scheme. He was the attending physician and had to declare James dead and issue a death certificate. David, you are a famous doctor, but you can't even save your best brother. Are you worthy of him? I cried and slapped him with all my strength. Sister-in-law, I tried my best. David felt pain. Stop hitting him. James was already beyond help when he was sent here. I didn't listen to David's explanation at all. I just wanted to hit him. This son of a bitch, he helped the tyrant in his last life, helped James fake his death, and made me bear a huge debt and live a life worse than death. You are sworn brothers. You said that you don't ask to be born on the same day of the same month of the same year, but you ask to die on the same day of the same month of the same year. Go and die now, and accompany my husband in the underworld. I turned into a shrew and scratched David's face, and his face was bruised. Sister-in-law, that was a drunken joke. Papa, I slapped David twice with tears of grievance, crying, heaven above and earth below are witnesses to our sworn brotherhood, and you actually said it was a joke. My husband treats you as a brother, but you treat my husband as a monkey. I seriously doubt that you didn't try your best to save my husband. David responded with embarrassment, Sister-in-law, I swear, I tried my best to save James, but I'm not a god, and there's really nothing I can do. I collapsed on the ground, sobbing, husband, wake up, how can you bear to leave me alone? Sister-in-law, no matter how sad you are, James will never come back, please take care of yourself. David handed me a bottle of mineral water and said, drink some water and relax. I thought to myself, no matter how much water I drink, it won't ease the pain in my heart. In my last life, I drank this mineral water and passed out. When I woke up, my mother-in-law was holding James's urn. So, I threw the mineral water directly on David's head. Ah! He cried out in pain and shouted angrily, Sister-in-law, don't go too far. I said with red eyes, I went too far. You are my husband's brother, but you didn't even shed a tear, and you still said I went too far. David was stunned, turned his face away guiltily, and said aggrievedly, I am very sad inside. David, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been angry with you. I wiped my tears and my voice softened. David breathed a sigh of relief and said, Sister-in-law, I understand. I don't blame you. Although James is gone, I want him to live in another way. I said gently while looking at James' body. David had a puzzled look on his face. Sister-in-law, what do you mean? I took out my cell phone and called the organ donation room of the hospital. Yes, it's my husband, he just passed away, I want to donate his organs to those in need. Hearing this, David turned pale with fear. As the saying goes, there is always a loophole. They never thought that I would donate organs. Sister-in-law, how could you take the initiative to donate James' organs? David was so anxious that he was sweating. I responded coldly, I am his wife, I have the right. David said anxiously, James is dead, and you still want to mess with his body. What you are doing is really disappointing to me. I frowned and asked in confusion, David, you are a doctor, how can you say such a thing? My husband is dead, but his organs can still save many people. As a doctor, don't you even have this awareness? After hearing this, David was stunned, his face turning pale and blue. Dr. Robert from the donation room was upstairs and soon entered the ward. When he saw me, he held my hand tightly and said with emotion, Ma'am, thank you for your support for the medical cause. Here is the donation agreement, please sign it. I signed it quickly. David was sweating profusely and said in a panic, James' mother has not agreed to donate yet. According to regulations, as long as one direct relative does not agree, the donation cannot be made. I said calmly, David, my mother-in-law is a very righteous person. Besides, when James was alive, he told me that if he passed away one day, he would donate his organs to people in need. James has always been a loving person, and I must help him fulfill his last wish. When did James say something like that? David questioned. Do I have to tell you everything we say between husband and wife? I asked back. He was speechless. I looked at Robert and said, Doctor, my husband died of a myocardial infarction. Except for his heart, everything else can be donated. His eyes, internal organs, bones, and skin can all be given to those in need. The rest of his body can be donated to the medical university for practical classes or research. Robert said excitedly, Ma'am, I am deeply moved by your generosity. To be honest, there is an 18-year-old girl with kidney failure who urgently needs a kidney transplant, and there is also a child who needs a cornea. While we were talking, David walked out of the ward with his cell phone in his hand. He must have urged my mother-in-law to come quickly. I urged her, there is no time to lose. Push my husband away and take out all the organs. If you delay for a minute, the organs may become diseased. Looking at me with a face that showed great understanding, Dr. Robert from the donation room pushed the bed out. You can't leave. David stood at the door, his hair standing on end and sweat dripping down his forehead. Dr. David, what are you doing? Dr. Robert from the donation room asked in surprise. David, please get out of the way. If the donation is delayed, my husband's last wish cannot be fulfilled, I blamed him. James actually. Anyway, you can't leave, sister-in-law, I beg you. David was so anxious that he was incoherent and almost told the truth. Dr. David, please don't interfere with my work. Dr. Robert in the donation room frowned. Dr. Robert, the deceased's mother hasn't arrived yet. Sister-in-law, no matter what, you have to let your mother-in-law, Ms. Karen, see James for the last time. David said firmly. Dr. Robert said, take the organs first, it won't be too late to see you again. You just heard it, there are so many patients waiting for organ transplants. Saving lives is like putting out a fire, we can't afford to delay. You also heard what this family member said, Dr. David, please move aside, or I will report it to the dean. The mother-in-law rushed over excitedly and roared angrily, Mary, you vicious woman, my son just died and you want to dismember him, I will not forgive you. I calmly explained, mother-in-law, it's not dismemberment, it's organ donation. The mother-in-law angrily asked, who allowed you to do this? I responded coldly, I am helping James fulfill his last wish. The mother-in-law continued, you are talking nonsense. How could my son donate his organs? I absolutely disagree. The mother-in-law pushed Dr. Robert away and shouted angrily, get out. I will not donate my son's organs. Dr. Robert from the donation room left in a huff. David heaved a sigh of relief, his tense nerves relaxing. James on the bed was probably also feeling lucky to have survived. My poor son, if you die, how can I live? The mother-in-law pretended to throw herself on James and burst into tears, then said, it's all because of you, the unlucky star, you killed my son. I want you to pay with your life. The mother-in-law turned the gun and slapped me. I was furious. In the previous life, it was the mother-in-law who sent James' body to the crematorium for cremation. Obviously, she also knew that James was faking his death. Karen, you have to understand, it was not me who killed James, but you. I pushed her away and roared fiercely. The mother-in-law was shocked. Karen said guiltily, you are slandering me. How could I possibly kill my son? I responded angrily, why does James work so hard to make money by socializing? It's all because of you. You are a gambler and lose money every day. My husband and I have paid off so much debt for you. Don't you know? Karen blushed and said, my gambling debts totaled just over $1 million US. I said sarcastically, Karen, you are making it sound so easy. The average wage in our city is only $1,800 US, and most people can't save more than $1 million US in their lifetime. And 2 months ago, your medical expenses cost more than $20,000 US, which was also paid by my husband and me. Don't think I don't know that you were not injured in a fall, you were beaten up and were hospitalized. You hang out in mahjong halls all day, flirt with other men, and get beaten up by married men. I can understand that you are lonely and itchy, but why can't you just find an old man properly? Why do you have to find a married man? The mother-in-law was so ashamed that she quickly argued, you are talking nonsense. I've read your discharge summary, and your romantic stories have been spread all over the place. You old and disrespectful guy, it's you who caused James' death. I cursed loudly, feeling very happy. Shut up. My mother-in-law rushed towards me hysterically, pretending to strangle me. I dodged and she hit the wall and fainted immediately. Mother-in-law. I picked her up anxiously and rushed to an empty bed opposite. David followed closely behind. David, hurry up and save my mother-in-law. Nurse, nurse, come quickly. I rushed to the corridor and shouted. Soon, several nurses rushed into the ward, and David was treating my mother-in-law. Taking advantage of this gap, I put a bag of James' clothes on the bed, and then pushed James into the elevator. At the door, the funeral home's car was already waiting. I took out $1,000 and gave it to the driver, asking him to take the fastest route to arrive. After driving for a while, I received a call from my mother-in-law, but I didn't answer it. David's call followed soon after, but I didn't answer it either. James and I were the only ones in the trunk. I opened my bag and looked for the lottery ticket. I soon found it in the phone case, sandwiched between a folded $100 bill. He always liked to put $100 bills in the phone case, implying that with money in my hand, the world is mine. The lottery ticket was a single bet, 40 times the prize, with a prize of $200 million. With this money, I can enjoy life in this lifetime. I lifted the white cloth and found that James' crotch was soaked. It seemed that the little incident of organ donation just now scared him to death. At the same time, it also verified that although he could not move, he was conscious. I gritted my teeth and said, James, I found a lottery ticket worth $200 million US. Are you wondering why I know all this? I tell you, I was reborn. In the last life, you and your first love were rich and prosperous, but you left me with a lot of debts. The loan sharks forced me to work in the club, and I contracted a lot of diseases. In the end, you ran me over with your car and killed me. Just tell me, are you a human being? You like to fake your death so much, I will fulfill your wish in this life. After entering the crematorium, taste the feeling of being burned to death. James' eyelids suddenly twitched a few times. I said proudly, are you scared? You didn't expect it would become true, did you? Do you regret it? Do you want me to let you go? That's impossible. I must cremate you today. My mother-in-law and David kept calling me, so I simply turned on the do not disturb function. After more than 30 minutes, we arrived at the funeral home. I thought I could be cremated right away, but I never expected that there were still 6 numbers ahead of me. I asked the staff, and they said it would take at least 3 hours for my turn. I was anxious, because my mother-in-law and David must be on their way. Suddenly, an idea flashed in my mind, and I threw myself on James and cried, Husband, what should I do? I can't cremate you before 11 o'clock. If I miss the time, you will never be reincarnated. The family members waiting for cremation looked at me. I knelt on the ground and begged them, there is a custom in our hometown that the cremation time cannot be later than 11 o'clock in the morning, otherwise the soul will not be able to catch the ferry to the city of the dead. Uncles and aunts, can you let me jump the queue? Some of them showed sympathy, some hesitated, and some did not comment. I took out my mobile phone and begged, I will compensate you $3,000 US. When they heard that there was money to be made, they agreed to let me jump the queue. I transferred $3,000 US to each of the 6 numbers ahead. 10 minutes later, I pushed James into the crematorium. I noticed that James' middle finger was twitching a few times. I leaned over and whispered in James' ear, are you scared? Are you regretting? It's too late. The crematorium staff asked me to wait outside. I begged, Master, please, let me take my husband on his last journey. I gave him the last $1,000 in cash in my pocket. Rest in peace, my dear. I pushed James into the crematorium with my own hands and pressed the red fire button. Suddenly, the furnace was ablaze with flames. Soon, with a bang, the door of the crematorium was pushed open. It was Grandma and David who had arrived. Seeing the raging fire in the furnace, Grandma screamed and fainted. "Turn it off quickly, James is not dead yet." David rushed over and shouted anxiously. I demanded, "David, what are you talking about? You were the one who declared James dead, and you issued the death certificate. Now you say James is not dead. What do you mean?" David looked panicked, his eyes were filled with fear, and his whole body was shaking uncontrollably. He didn't expect things to turn out like this. I just don't want to accept the fact that James is dead. He is not dead, he will always live in my heart. David changed his words. He knew very well that what he did was a crime, and once he admitted that James was not dead, he would go to jail and be ruined. Your friend's words are really scary. I thought a living person was pushed in. But even if it was a living person, he is dead now, the master said. Suddenly, James raised his arm high in the incinerator. I was shocked. Don't be afraid, this is a normal muscle reaction, just like a fish with its belly cut open can still be thrown into a frying pan, the master explained. So that's what happened. David and I both knew that this wasn't a muscle reaction, but James was struggling in pain. David vomited. He indirectly killed James, and it was hard to bear. I asked hypocritically, David, what's wrong with you? David responded guiltily, I'm fine. He knelt on the ground and couldn't get up for a while. David took my mother-in-law back to the hospital, and I took James's urn and the bag of clothes home first. Then I went to my mother's house. After seeing my mother, I couldn't hold back my tears and hugged her tightly and cried. In my previous life, my mother sold her house to help me. She washed dishes in a restaurant and picked up garbage at night. She used all the money she earned to pay off my debts, and eventually died of overwork. I feel sorry for my mother. What's wrong? If you miss your mother, just come to see her more often in the future, my mother said gently. With red eyes, I said, Mom, after I have dealt with everything, we will live together. My father passed away early, and it was my mother who raised me with great difficulty. My mother made my favorite braised pork, which she usually couldn't bear to buy meat. At the dinner table, my mother talked about something. She said she bought a lottery ticket last week and chose a random single note and bought 4 times. The boss heard it as 40 times and printed out the ticket. This lottery ticket has been on the coffee table, but I don't know when it disappeared. Yesterday, when my mother passed by the lottery store, she saw that the lottery store had issued a jackpot of $200 million. I don't know if that jackpot is the ticket she bought. Even if it is, I can't find the lottery ticket. I'm really old and confused. My mother sighed. I was shocked and hurriedly took out the lottery ticket and looked at the lottery outlet. It was indeed the lottery shop opposite my mother's community. Mom, the lottery ticket is here. I won $200 million. I handed the lottery ticket to my mother. My mother excitedly put on her reading glasses and looked at it. Really won $200 million? Yes, it's true. I remembered that in my previous life, James and I came to my mother's house for dinner. At that time, my mother and I were cooking in the kitchen and heard James shouting excitedly in the living room. I walked out of the kitchen and asked him what happened. He hesitated for a long time before saying that he had received a large order. It seems that he saw my mother's lottery ticket, checked it and found out that he had won the jackpot, and then embezzled it. This beast took my mother's lottery ticket and put me in debt. Mom, you don't need that much money, I'll give you the lottery ticket. I'll be happy if you two live well. My mother stuffed the lottery ticket into my hand. I couldn't stop my tears from flowing, and I hugged my mother and cried again. After a long time, I returned the lottery ticket to my mother and told her that James had died of a heart attack and had been cremated. My mother was very sad after hearing this. Mom, you don't have to be sad for James. He had been sleeping with his first love for a long time, and he had borrowed a lot of foreign debts without telling me. Even if he didn't die, I was planning to divorce him. I can't cash this lottery ticket. If I cash it, it will easily become marital property, and then my difficult mother-in-law will definitely want a piece of it. So, you should cash it, and I will ask you for money when I need it. The mother agreed, okay, I'll listen to you. After dinner, I returned to my home. The door was ajar, and the lock had been pried open. Ms. Karen, we can't find it. It was the voice of James' first love, Susan. Look for it carefully again. Mother-in-law said anxiously. It seems that they are looking for the lottery ticket. I walked in and asked, what are you doing? My mother-in-law and Susan were shocked. My mother-in-law stiffened her neck and said, is there anything wrong with me coming to my son's house? I glared at Susan and said, "It's okay for you to come, but it's a problem for her to come." The mother-in-law quickly explained, "Susan is here to help me pack up my son's belongings." Looking at the mess in my house, I angrily said, "Are you sure you are collecting the remains? It looks like robbers entering the village. You two get out of my house right now." The mother-in-law said arrogantly, "Mary, half of this house belongs to my son. I will not give you a single cent of my son's property." I said contemptuously, "You have no say. Legally, I am the first heir." Susan jumped out and proudly showed off her bulging belly. "Mary, I am pregnant with James' child. This child is the first heir." My mother-in-law looked at me and said proudly, "Mary, you didn't expect that my son is so brave outside." I smiled and said, "Then let's go to the law firm now. I will unconditionally give up all of James's property and give it all to you." It seems that they either didn't know that James owed a lot of debts, or they thought that after inheriting James's property, they would not have to inherit the debts. When we arrived at the law firm and I signed the inheritance agreement, they were overjoyed. When we left, my mother-in-law stopped me and whispered, "Mary, have you seen a lottery ticket?" I asked James to buy that ticket and it won more than $500,000. "If you return it to me, I will give you $100,000. How about that?" I asked in mock confusion. "I don't see any lottery tickets." My mother-in-law said anxiously, "Giving you $200,000 should be okay, right?" I said firmly, "I really didn't see any lottery ticket." I laughed in my heart. In my mother-in-law's mind, James' life or death is secondary, money is the primary thing. My mother-in-law was skeptical, and then she said that she was going to sell the house that James and I had, and she would give me half of the money after the sale. I agreed, but in fact, James had already mortgaged the house to the bank, so there was no way to sell it. The next morning, I was sleeping soundly when Karen and Susan knocked on the door. "Mary, you bitch, get out. You screwed us so badly, you are such a jerk." I opened the door, Karen reached out to slap me, I grabbed her hand, pushed her down, and said sternly, "Don't touch me." She used to be arrogant to me because James was around, but now that James is dead, she knows that I will not show mercy. Karen sat on the ground and cried loudly, "Mary, how can you be so cruel? I was wondering why you were so kind yesterday and gave up unconditionally inheriting my son's estate. Now you inherit the estate and also the debt. The debt is over $10 million, and we can't pay it back even if we sell us. Mary, come with us to the law firm now and change the heir to you." I had finally dumped my foreign debt on them, how could I possibly jump into the fire pit again? I smiled and said, "You're dreaming. You are so vicious." Susan gritted her teeth. I sneered, "It's better for me to be vicious than for you to be shameless. Why be a lover when there are so many other things to do? You originally wanted to cling to James and live a good life, so you got pregnant with him. Now your dream is shattered. I advise you to abort the child." Karen said anxiously, "Susan, you must not abort the child. It is the only bloodline of our James family." Susan was in great pain and tears welled up in her eyes. Karen quickly thought of a solution and said, "Susan, this bitch cheated us out of the inheritance. We can sue her. Also, the loan was taken out during the marriage between my son and this bitch, so this bitch should be responsible for the debt." Susan said unwillingly, "Yes, we only inherit James's property, not the debt. The debt is yours. Let's go find a lawyer now." I said coldly, "Whatever you want, I'll accompany you to the end." 3 days later, I received a letter from a lawyer. The next day, I went to Dahua law firm with my lawyer. After the other lawyer explained the law to me, the lawyer I hired said, "My agent has never participated in the affairs of James' company. James's loans were all borrowed in his personal name and in the name of the company. The debts should be borne by the heirs of James' estate. Although the law stipulates that inheriting an estate also inherits debts, the debts were incurred during the marriage between Ms. Mary and Mr. James, unless Ms. Mary can prove that she has not used the money borrowed by Mr. James." I was well prepared and put a thick stack of evidence in front of the other lawyer. "This is James's expense record. A small part of it was spent on the company's business, and most of it was spent on Karen and Susan." Karen cursed loudly, "Mary, you shameless bitch, don't try to confuse right and wrong. You used the money my son borrowed. Yes, when James was alive, he often told me that you spend money lavishly. In order to satisfy your selfish desires, James borrowed a lot of money." Susan said cunningly. She thought that now that James was dead, there would be no evidence to prove his mistake. Their lawyers looked at the evidence one by one, their faces becoming darker and darker. On it were the transfer records from James to Susan over the years, as well as the credit card records and accommodation records when traveling, and a record of a $500,000 expenditure for Susan to buy a car. In addition, there were also records of various items bought for Susan. As for Karen, she often asked James for money. There were dozens of sheets of transfer records, one of which was a $1 million expenditure for Karen to pay off her gambling debts. All the money added up corresponded to the foreign debts borrowed by James. All this evidence was found on James's phone, and I never looked at his phone before. This is evidence fabricated by a bitch. Lawyer Thomas, you must not believe her. After looking at the evidence, Karen turned pale with anxiety. Susan blushed and said anxiously, yes, they are all forged. How could I have spent so much money from James? Lawyer Thomas glared at them and said coldly, are you sure they are forged? If it is verified to be true, you will be charged with false accusation. After hearing this, Karen and Susan shut up in panic. We at Dahua Law Firm will not take this case. Please go back. Lawyer Thomas ordered them to leave. At night, a group of vicious thugs came to my house. They were loan sharks. James was dead, but that didn't mean the debt was cleared. They threatened me that I had to pay back the money for James. The leader, Scar, said viciously, if you don't pay, don't blame me for being cruel. I responded calmly, first of all, I unconditionally gave up James' inheritance. My mother-in-law Karen inherited all of James' inheritance, including the debts. Secondly, it was James who borrowed the money from you, not me. Finally, the money James borrowed from you was all spent on his lover. I didn't spend a penny. Why should I pay it back? I handed a thick stack of transfer evidence to Scar. Scar still refused to give up after seeing this. You are James' wife, so you should admit the debt. Just then, a tall middle-aged man walked in. 3 days ago, I met Officer William from the anti-gang office through my lawyer. Before opening the door, I called Officer William. When he saw Officer William appear, Scar immediately stood up, looking trembling with fear. Officer William patted his head and said, Joseph, you are so capable that you even dare to threaten my friend. Do you want to go in again? Joseph said guiltily, Officer William, I really didn't know she was your friend. If I knew, I wouldn't dare to do it even if I had 10,000 guts. Officer William said viciously, get out of here. If I find out that you are causing trouble for my friends again, I will kill you. Joseph ran away in shame with his men. After that, Joseph set his sights on Karen and Susan, and started a crazy debt collection mode. The methods used by this group of people were very cruel, and they would do anything to get what they wanted. Karen sold her house, and Susan sold the car James bought for her, but the horrible thing about usury is that the interest is compounded, and this hole can't be filled at all. The principal is $2 million, and it is still $3 million owed, and the interest is still rolling every day. At night, I went home and saw Karen and Susan sitting on the steps at the door with their faces disfigured. Daughter-in-law, you are finally back. Save us. Karen saw me as if she saw a savior. I asked knowingly, what happened? Karen begged, the loan sharks insisted that we pay back the money, and they left us with nowhere to go. Daughter-in-law, please be kind and help us. I said awkwardly, James spent all the money he borrowed from loan sharks on you, you should pay it back. Besides, I don't have the money to help you. Karen blushed and asked, daughter-in-law, don't you have any private money? I smiled and said, even if there is, why should I help you pay off your debt? Karen pleaded, after all, we are mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. I have always treated you as my own daughter. Are you so heartless? I sneered contemptuously, aren't you ashamed to say such things? Our relationship has always been incompatible, and you dare to say that you treat me as your own daughter. Also, you are an extremely selfish person and you only care about yourself. James's urn has been at home for so long. Have you asked about the cemetery? Have you thought about holding a funeral? Karen was speechless. I continued, the bank will take over this house in 2 days, so don't come here again. I opened the door and went in, shutting it heavily. In my last life, I suffered the pain of paying off my debts, and in this life, you too will also have to experience it. 2 days later, the house was taken away by the bank, and I moved into my mother's house. I went to the lottery center with my mother to claim the prize, and the money was deposited into my mother's bank account. After I had the money, I bought a luxury car and a villa. That day, I brought the interior designer to the villa, but Karen and Susan followed me. It seemed that they knew that I was staying at my mother's house during this period. I asked the designer to leave. Karen looked at me and said angrily, you bitch, I knew you stole the lottery ticket, give me the winnings. I asked in confusion, what lottery ticket? Susan said shamelessly, still pretending. My son told me before he died that the lottery ticket he bought won a jackpot of $200 million. No wonder I couldn't find the lottery ticket, it must have been stolen by you, a bitch. Consider this villa and luxury car as my kindness to you, just return the rest of the prize money to us. Susan, do you have any shame? Regardless of whether James has such a lottery ticket that won $200 million, even if he does, it is our marital property. Is it your turn? I said sternly. Susan said proudly, I am pregnant with James' child, so of course I have the right to share the prize money. I said sarcastically, you said it's James' child, right? We have to give birth to the child and do a paternity test. Susan said disapprovingly, just do it, I'm 100% sure it's James' child. But I had dealt with all of James' things, and the ashes couldn't be used for paternity testing, so it would be useless if she gave birth to the baby. Susan continued, do you really think I can't do anything? I can ask the child and grandma to do a paternity test. It seems that Susan doesn't understand at all. Even if the child and grandma do a paternity test, it can only prove that there is a blood relationship, but it cannot prove that James is the parent-child relationship. If you don't believe me, you can consult a doctor. I sneered and exposed her. Susan was stunned. Karen said angrily, bitch, I'm James' mother, I have the right to share the bonus, right? Give me back my share, or I'll sue you. Yes, Ms. Karen has the right to share the bonus, and you have nothing to say about it. Susan said proudly. I responded calmly, you two won't get a penny. Karen said to me viciously, what, are you determined to keep the money for yourself? I said coldly, Karen, if James really had a lottery ticket that won $200 million, I would definitely share the money with you, but the problem is that he doesn't have one. Karen yelled, you're talking nonsense. If not, how could you afford a villa and a luxury car? I said proudly, my mother gave me the money to buy it. They were surprised and asked, your mother? Your mother is a retired person, how can she afford to buy you a villa and a luxury car? I deliberately provoked them and said proudly, my mother won $200 million in the lottery. Oh, I get it. You gave my son's lottery ticket to your mother and asked her to claim the prize. You vicious bitch, give the money back to us. After saying that, Karen stomped her feet in anger. I asked, everything requires evidence. What evidence do you have to prove that the lottery ticket belongs to James? I have evidence. Susan took out her phone and played a recording. In the recording, James said, I bought a lottery ticket and won $200 million. I don't want to give Mary a penny. If we file for divorce, the procedure will take a long time. And even if we divorce, if she knows that I won the jackpot, she can still divide my prize money. These days, I came up with a plan to fake my death. If it succeeds, David, I will give you $5 million. Susan, I will give you a good life. Mom, haven't you always wanted to go to Las Vegas to gamble? I'll give you money and you can go and have fun. It turned out that Susan had a trick up her sleeve, fearing that James would regret it later. Susan said smugly, well, you didn't expect there was this recording, did you? James made it very clear that the $200 million lottery ticket is his. James faked his death? I pretended to be shocked and said, you murdered him. Karen yelled, bitch, you killed my son and cremated him alive. I can let this debt go, but you have to give us the rest of the bonus, or I'll call the police to arrest you. You don't have to call the police, I'll do it. I took out my cell phone, dialed 911, and said loudly, I want to report that my husband was murdered. They were both shocked. They didn't expect that I would take the initiative. Bitch, you're still pretending not to know. You committed murder on purpose to embezzle the lottery ticket. Mary, you must know James's plan. They insisted that I knew the truth. I ignored them. Soon the police came and took us all back to the police station. The key point of the whole thing is the lottery ticket. If this lottery ticket with a winning amount of $200 million was really bought by James, and I redeemed the prize and bought a luxury car and a villa, then there is reason to suspect that I knew in advance that James had faked his death in order to keep the lottery ticket for myself. If the lottery ticket that James said did not exist, then I had no motive for committing a crime. The police quickly launched an investigation. They found out that my mother went to claim the prize, and there was still more than $100 million in her account. My mother said it was the prize money from the lottery. The police took my mother to the lottery shop, and the boss recognized my mother at a glance. She was the winner of the $200 million grand prize. Because my mother only bought 4 times at that time, the boss heard it as 40 times. This incident is deeply remembered. Afterwards, the boss checked the surveillance of the lottery shop and confirmed that it was my mother who bought the lottery ticket, and the lottery shop was just opposite my mother's community. What I said was confirmed, but there was no evidence at all for James's claim that he won the $200 million lottery. He could even say $2 billion without any evidence. Karen still insisted that I knew her son was faking his death and I cremated him on purpose. But there is no evidence that I knew James was faking his death, and I even bought a cemetery for James. There is no problem on my side, but the three of them are in trouble. After Susan blew herself up, the police investigated David's series of abnormal and illegal operations after James was sent to the hospital. By questioning the nurses and checking the hospital surveillance, they confirmed the criminal facts of the three of them. I rushed here from work after receiving David's call, so it was impossible for me to know that this was a conspiracy. So even if I cremated James with my own hands, I am not guilty. The three of them participated in the plan to fake their death, which led to James' death, which is intentional homicide. They were arrested soon, but because Susan was pregnant, she could only be placed under house arrest and would not go to jail until the child was born. Half a year later, they were sentenced to life imprisonment for joint crime. Another 8 months later, Susan gave birth to the child. Before going to prison, she begged to see me. Ms. Mary, I was wrong to you before, but the child is innocent. After I went to prison, he was left alone. Can you adopt him? I know this request is unreasonable, but the child is James's flesh and blood after all. Please help me for James's sake. She knelt on the ground and begged me with tears in her eyes. I'm not so kind as to raise a child for you. I believe that after you go in, the government will make proper arrangements for the child. I refused directly. After the dust settled, I felt relieved. When I returned to the villa, my mother had already prepared a delicious meal. In this life, I want to accompany my mother well and make her happy every day.